When a person wishes to give special recognition to a book, he predicts that it will still be read 100 years from now. The law, first published as a pamphlet in June 1850, is already much more than 100 years old. And because its truths are eternal, it will still be read when another century has passed. Frederic Bastiat was born in 1801, and he died in 1850. He was a French economist, statesman, and author. He did most of his writing during the years just before and immediately following the Revolution of February 1848. This was the period when France was rapidly turning to complete socialism. As a deputy to the Legislative Assembly, Mr. Bastiat was studying and explaining each socialist fallacy as it appeared, and he explained how socialism must inevitably degenerate into communism. But most of his countrymen chose to ignore his logic. The law is here presented as part of the spoken word library because the same situation exists in America today as in France of 1848. The same socialist communist ideas and plans that were then adopted in France have already swept America. The explanations and arguments then advanced against socialism by Mr. Bastiat are, word for word, equally valid today. And so it is with a feeling of great urgency for this message that I now read for you The Law by Frederic Bastiat. The law perverted, and the police powers of the state perverted along with it. The law, I say, not only turned from its proper purpose, but made to follow an entirely contrary purpose. The law become the weapon of every kind of greed. Instead of checking crime, the law itself guilty of the evils it is supposed to punish. If this is true, it is a serious fact, and moral duty requires me to call the attention of my fellow citizens to it. We hold from God the gift which includes all others. This gift is life, physical and moral life. But life cannot maintain itself alone. The Creator of life has entrusted us with the responsibility of preserving, developing, and perfecting it. In order that we may accomplish this, He has provided us with a collection of marvelous faculties, and He has put us in the midst of a variety of natural resources. By the application of our faculties to these natural resources, we convert them into products and use them. This process is necessary in order that life may run its appointed course. Life, faculties, production. In other words, individuality, liberty, property. This is man. And in spite of the cunning of artful political leaders, these three gifts from God precede all human legislation and are superior to it. Life, liberty, and property. They do not exist because men have made laws. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. What then is law? It is the collective organization of the individual right to lawful defense. Each of us has a natural right from God to defend his person, his liberty, and his property. These are the three basic requirements of life, and the preservation of any one of them is completely dependent upon the preservation of the other two. For what are our faculties but the extension of our individuality? And what is property but an extension of our faculties? If every person has the right to defend, even by force, his person, his liberty, and his property, then it follows that a group of men have the right to organize and support a common force to protect these rights constantly. Thus the principle of collective right, its reason for existing, its lawfulness, is based on individual right. And the common force that protects this collective right cannot logically have any other purpose or any other mission than that for which it acts as a substitute. Thus, since an individual cannot lawfully use force against the person, liberty, or property of another individual, then the common force, for the same reason, cannot lawfully be used to destroy the person, liberty, or property of individuals or groups. Such a perversion of force would be in both cases contrary to our premise. Force has been given to us to defend our own individual rights. Who will dare to say that force has been given to us to destroy the equal rights of our brothers? Since no individual acting separately can lawfully use force to destroy the rights of others, does it not logically follow that the same principle also applies to the common force? That is nothing more than the organized combination of the individual forces? If this is true, then nothing can be more evident than this. The law is the organization of the natural right of lawful defense. It is the substitution of a common force for individual forces. And this common force is to do only what the individual forces have a natural and lawful right to do, to protect persons, liberties, and properties, to maintain the right of each, and to cause justice to reign over us all. If a nation were founded on this basis, it seems to me that order would prevail among the people in thought as well as in deed. It seems to me that such a nation would have the most simple, easy to accept, economical, limited, non-oppressive, just, and enduring government imaginable, whatever its political form might be. Under such an administration, everyone would understand that he possessed all the privileges as well as all the responsibilities of his existence. No one would have any argument with government, provided that his person was respected, his labor was free, and the fruits of his labor were protected against all. When successful, we would not have to thank the state for our success. And conversely, when unsuccessful, we would no more think of blaming the state for our misfortune than would the farmers blame the state because of hail or frost. The state would be felt only by the invaluable blessings of safety provided by this concept of government. It can be further stated that thanks to the non-intervention of the state in private affairs, our wants and their satisfactions would develop themselves in a logical manner. We would not see cities populated at the expense of rural districts, nor rural districts at the expense of cities. We would not see the great displacements of capital, labor, and population that are caused by legislative decisions. The sources of our existence are made uncertain and precarious by these state-created displacements. And furthermore, these acts burden the government with increased responsibilities. But unfortunately, law by no means confines itself to its proper functions. And when it has exceeded its proper functions, it has not done so merely in some inconsequential and debatable matters. The law has gone further than this. It has acted in direct opposition to its own purpose. The law has been used to destroy its own objective. It has been applied to annihilating the justice that it was supposed to maintain, to limiting and destroying rights which its real purpose was to respect. The law has placed the collective force at the disposal of the unscrupulous, who wish without risk to exploit the person, liberty, and property of others. It has converted plunder into a right in order to protect plunder, and it has converted lawful defense into a crime in order to punish lawful defense. How has this perversion of the law been accomplished, and what have been the results? The law has been perverted by the influence of two entirely different causes: stupid greed and false philanthropy. Let us speak of the first. Self-preservation and self-development are common aspirations among all people, and if everyone enjoyed the unrestricted use of his faculties and the free disposition of the fruits of his labor, social progress would be ceaseless, uninterrupted, and unfailing. But there is also another tendency that is common among the people. When they can, they wish to live and prosper at the expense of others. This is no rash accusation, nor does it come from a gloomy and uncharitable spirit. The annals of history bear witness to the truth of it. The incessant wars, mass migrations, religious persecutions, universal slavery, dishonesty in commerce, and monopolies. This fatal desire has its origin in the very nature of man, in that primitive, universal, and insuppressible instinct that impels him to satisfy his desires with the least possible pain. Man can live and satisfy his wants only by ceaseless labor, by the ceaseless application of his faculties to natural resources. This process is the origin of property. But it is also true that a man may live and satisfy his wants by seizing and consuming the products of the labor of others. This process is the origin of plunder. Now, since man is naturally inclined to avoid pain, And since labor is pain in itself, it follows that men will resort to plunder whenever plunder is easier than work. History shows this quite clearly. And under these conditions, neither religion nor morality can stop it. When then does plunder stop? It stops when it becomes more painful and more dangerous than labor. It is evident then that the proper purpose of law is to use the power of its collective force to stop this fatal tendency to plunder instead of to work. All the measures of the law should protect property and punish plunder. But generally the law is made by one man or one class of men, and since law cannot operate without the sanction and support of a dominating force, this force must be entrusted to those who make the laws. This fact, combined with the fatal tendency that exists in the heart of man to satisfy his wants with the least possible effort, explains the almost universal perversion of the law. Thus it is easy to understand how law, instead of checking injustice, becomes the invincible weapon of injustice. It is easy to understand why the law is used by the legislator to destroy in varying degrees among the rest of the people their personal independence by slavery, their liberty by oppression, and their property by plunder. This is done for the benefit of the person who makes the law and in proportion to the power that he holds. Men naturally rebel against the injustice of which they are victims. Thus, when plunder is organized by law for the profit of those who make the law, all the plundered classes try somehow to enter by peaceful or revolutionary means into the making of laws. According to their degree of enlightenment, these plundered classes may propose one of two entirely different purposes when they attempt to attain political power. Either they may wish to stop lawful plunder, or they may wish to share in it. Woe to the nation when this latter purpose prevails among the mass victims of lawful plunder, when they, in turn, seize the power to make laws. Until that happens, the few practice lawful plunder upon the many, a common practice where the right to participate in the making of law is limited to a few persons. But then participation in the making of the law becomes universal, and then men seek to balance their conflicting interests by universal plunder. Instead of rooting out the injustices found in society, they make these injustices general. As soon as the plundered classes gain political power, they establish a system of reprisals against other classes. They do not abolish legal plunder. This objective would demand more enlightenment than they possess. Instead, they emulate their evil predecessors by participating in this legal plunder, even though it is against their own interest. It is as if it were necessary before a reign of justice appears for everyone to suffer cruel retribution, some for their evilness and some for their lack of understanding. It is impossible to introduce into society a greater change and a greater evil than this, the conversion of the law into an instrument of plunder. What are the consequences of such a perversion? It would require volumes to describe them all. Thus, we must content ourselves with pointing out the most striking. In the first place, it erases from everyone's conscience the distinction between justice and injustice. No society can exist unless the laws are respected to a certain degree. The safest way to make laws respected is to make them respectable. When law and morality contradict each other, the citizen has the cruel alternative of either losing his moral sense or losing his respect for law. These two evils are of equal consequence, and it would be difficult for a person to choose between them. The nature of law is to maintain justice. This is so much the case that in the minds of the people, law and justice are one and the same thing. There is in all of us a strong disposition to believe that anything lawful is also legitimate. This belief is so widespread that many persons have erroneously held that things are just because law makes them so. Thus, in order to make plunder appear just and sacred to many consciences, it is only necessary for the law to decree and sanction it. Slavery, restrictions, and monopoly find defenders not only among those who profit from them, but also among those who suffer from them. If you suggest a doubt as to the morality of these institutions, it is boldly said you are a dangerous innovator, a utopian, a theorist, a subversive. You would shatter the foundation upon which society rests. If you lecture upon morality or upon political science, there will be found official organizations petitioning the government in this vein of thought. Quote, that science no longer be taught exclusively from the point of view of free trade, of liberty, of property, and of justice, as has been the case until now, but also in the future, science is to be especially taught from the viewpoint of the facts and laws that regulate national industry, facts and laws which are contrary to liberty, to property, and to justice. That in government-endowed teaching positions, the professor rigorously refrain from endangering in the slightest degree the respect due to the laws now in force. End quote. Thus, if there exists a law which sanctions slavery or monopoly, oppression or robbery in any form whatsoever, it must not even be mentioned. For how can it be mentioned without damaging the respect which it inspires? Still further, morality and political economy must be taught from the point of view of this law, from the supposition that it must be a just law merely because it is a law. Another effect of this tragic perversion of the law is that it gives an exaggerated importance to political passions and conflicts and to politics in general. I could prove this assertion in 1,000 ways, but by way of illustration, I shall limit myself to a subject that has lately occupied the minds of everyone: universal suffrage. The followers of Rousseau's school of thought, who consider themselves far advanced, but whom I consider 20 centuries behind the times, will not agree with me on this. But universal suffrage, using the word in its strictest sense, is not one of those sacred dogmas which it is a crime to examine or doubt. In fact, serious objections may be made to universal suffrage. In the first place, the word universal conceals a gross fallacy. For example, there are 36 million people in the nation. Thus, to make the right of suffrage universal, there should be 36 million voters. But the most extended system permits only 9 million people to vote. 3 persons out of 4 are excluded. And more than this, they are excluded by the 4th. This 4th person advances the principles of incapacity as his reason for excluding the others. Universal suffrage means then universal suffrage for those who are capable. But there remains this question of fact: who is capable? Are minors, females, insane persons, the persons who have committed certain major crimes, the only ones to be determined incapable? A closer examination of the subject shows us the motive which causes the right of suffrage to be based upon the supposition of incapacity. The motive is that the elector or voter does not exercise the right for himself alone, but for everybody. The most extended elective system and the most restricted elective system are alike in this respect. They differ only in respect to what constitutes incapacity. It is not a difference of principle, but merely a difference of degree. If, as the Republicans of our present-day Greek and Roman schools of thought pretend, the right of suffrage arrives with one's birth, it would be an injustice for adults to prevent women and children from voting. Why are they prevented? Because they are presumed to be incapable. And why is incapacity a motive for exclusion? Because it is not the voter alone who suffers the consequences of his vote, because each vote touches and affects everyone in the entire community, because the people in the community have a right to demand some safeguards concerning the acts upon which their welfare is dependent. I know what might be said in answer to this, what the objections might be, but this is not the place to exhaust a controversy of this nature. I wish merely to observe here that this controversy over universal suffrage, as well as most other political questions which agitates, excites, and overthrows nations, would lose nearly all of its importance if the law had always been what it ought to be. In fact, if law were restricted to protecting all persons, all liberties, and all properties, if law were nothing more than the organized combination of the individual's right to self-defense, if law were the obstacle, the check, the punisher of all oppression and plunder, is it likely that we citizens would then argue much about the extent of the franchise? Under these circumstances, is it likely that the extent of the right to vote would endanger that supreme good, the public peace? Is it likely that excluded classes would refuse to peaceably await the coming of their right to vote? Is it likely that those who had the right to vote would jealously defend their privilege? If the law were confined to its proper functions, everyone's interest in the law would be the same. Is it not clear that under these circumstances, those who voted could not inconvenience those who did not vote? But on the other hand, imagine that this fatal principle had been introduced. Under the pretense of organization, regulation, protection, or encouragement, the law takes property from one person and gives it to another. The law takes the wealth of all and gives it to a few, whether farmers, manufacturers, ship owners, artists, or comedians. Under these circumstances, then certainly every class will aspire to grasp the law, and logically so. The excluded classes will furiously demand their right to vote, and will overthrow society rather than not to obtain it. Even beggars and vagabonds will then prove to you that they also have an incontestable title to vote. They will say to you, we cannot buy wine, tobacco, or salt without paying the tax. And as a part of the tax that we pay is given by law in privileges and subsidies to men who are richer than we are. Others use the law to raise the prices of bread, meat, iron, or cloth. Thus, since everyone else uses the law for his own profit, we also would like to use the law for our own profit. We demand from the law the right to relief, which is the poor man's plunder. To obtain this right, we also should be voters and legislators, in order that we may organize beggary on a grand scale for our own class, as you have organized protection on a grand scale for your class. Now don't tell us beggars that you will act for us, and then toss us, as Mr. Mimmerel proposes, 600,000 francs to keep us quiet, like throwing us a bone to gnaw. We have other claims. And anyway, we wish to bargain for ourselves, as other classes have bargained for themselves. And what can you say to answer that argument? As long as it is admitted that the law may be diverted from its true purpose, that it may violate property instead of protecting it, then everyone will want to participate in making the law, either to protect himself against plunder or to use it for plunder. Political questions will always be prejudicial, dominant, and all-absorbing. There will be fighting at the door of the legislative palace, and the struggle within will be no less furious. To know this, it is hardly necessary to examine what transpires inside the legislature. Merely to understand the issue is to know the answer. Is there any need to offer proof that this odious perversion of the law is a perpetual source of hatred and discord, that it tends to destroy society itself? If such proof is needed, look at the United States in this year of 1850. There is no country in the world where the law is kept more within its proper domain, the protection of every person's liberty and property. As a consequence of this, there appears to be no country in the world where the social order rests on a firmer foundation. But even in the United States, there are two issues, and only two, that have always endangered the public peace. What are these two issues? They are slavery and tariffs. These are the only two issues where, contrary to the general spirit of the Republic of the United States, law has assumed the character of a plunderer. Slavery is a violation by law of liberty. The protective tariff is a violation by law of property. It is a most remarkable fact that this double legal crime, the sorrowful inheritance from the old world, should be the only issue which can and perhaps will lead to the ruin of the Union. It is indeed impossible to imagine at the very heart of a society a more astounding fact than this. The law has come to be an instrument of injustice. And if this fact brings terrible consequences to the United States, where the proper purpose of the law has been perverted only in the instances of slavery and tariffs, what must be the consequences in Europe, where the perversion of the law is a principle, a system? Mr. de Montalembert, a politician and writer, adopting the thought contained in a famous proclamation by Mr. Carlier, has said, "We must make war against socialism." According to the definition of socialism advanced by Mr. Charles Dupin, he meant we must make war against plunder. But of what plunder was he speaking? For there are two kinds of plunder, legal and illegal. I do not think that illegal plunder, such as theft or swindling, which the Penal Code defines, anticipates, and punishes, can be called socialism. It is not this kind of plunder that systematically threatens the foundation of society. Anyway, the war against this kind of plunder has not waited for the command of these gentlemen. The war against illegal plunder has been fought since the beginning of the world, long before the Revolution of February 1848, long before the appearance even of socialism itself. France had provided police, judges, gendarmes, prisons, dungeons, and scaffolds for the purpose of fighting illegal plunder. The law itself conducts this war, and it is my wish and opinion that the law should always maintain this attitude toward plunder. But it does not always do this. Sometimes the law defends plunder and participates in it. Thus the beneficiaries are spared the shame, danger, and scruple which their acts would otherwise involve. Sometimes the law places the whole apparatus of judges, police, prisons, and gendarmes at the service of the plunderers, and treats the victim, when he defends himself, as a criminal. In short, there is a legal plunder, and it is of this, no doubt, that Mr. de Montalembert speaks. This legal plunder may be only an isolated stain among the legislative measures of the people. If so, it is best to wipe it out with a minimum of speeches and denunciations, and in spite of the uproar of the vested interests. But how is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simple. See if the law takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong. See if the law benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what the citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. Then abolish this law without delay, for it is not only an evil itself, but also it is a fertile source for further evils because it invites reprisals. If such a law, which may be an isolated case, is not abolished immediately, it will spread, multiply, and develop into a system. The person who profits from this law will complain bitterly, defending his acquired rights. He will claim that the state is obligated to protect and encourage his particular industry, that this procedure enriches the state because the protected industry is thus able to spend more and to pay higher wages to the poor working man. Do not listen to this sophistry by vested interests. The acceptance of these arguments will build legal plunder into a whole system. In fact, this already has occurred. The present-day delusion is an attempt to enrich everyone at the expense of everyone else, to make plunder universal under the pretense of organizing it. Now, legal plunder can be committed in an infinite number of ways. Thus, we have an infinite number of plans for organizing it: tariffs, protection, benefits, subsidies, encouragements, progressive taxation, public schools, guaranteed jobs, guaranteed profits, minimum wages, a right to relief, a right to the tools of labor, free credit, and so on and so on. All these plans as a whole, with their common aim of legal plunder, constitute socialism. Now, since under this definition, socialism is a body of doctrine, what attack can be made against it other than a war of doctrine? If you find this socialistic doctrine to be false, absurd, and evil, then refute it. And the more false, the more absurd, and the more evil it is, the easier it will be to refute. Above all, if you wish to be strong, begin by rooting out every particle of socialism that may have crept into your legislation. This will be no light task. Mr. de Montalembert has been accused of desiring to fight socialism by the use of brute force. He ought to be exonerated from this accusation, for he has plainly said, the war that we must fight against socialism must be in harmony with law, honor, and justice. But why does not Mr. Montalembert see that he has placed himself in a vicious circle? You would use the law to oppose socialism, but it is upon the law that socialism itself relies. Socialists desire to practice legal plunder, not illegal plunder. Socialists, like all other monopolists, desire to make the law their own weapon. And when once the law is on the side of socialism, how can it be used against socialism? For when plunder is abetted by the law, it does not fear your courts, your gendarmes, and your prisons. Rather, it may call upon them for help. To prevent this, you would exclude socialism from entering into the making of laws? You would prevent socialists from entering the legislative palace? You shall not succeed, I predict, so long as legal plunder continues to be the main business of the legislature. It is illogical, in fact absurd, to assume otherwise. This question of legal plunder must be settled once and for all, and there are only three ways to settle it. 1, the few plunder the many. 2, everybody plunders everybody. 3, nobody plunders anybody. We must make our choice among limited plunder, universal plunder, and no plunder. The law can follow only one of these three. Limited legal plunder. This system prevailed when the right to vote was restricted. One would turn back to this system to prevent the invasion of socialism. Universal legal plunder. We have been threatened with this system since the franchise was made universal. The newly franchised majority has decided to formulate law on the same principle of legal plunder that was used by their predecessors when the vote was limited. No legal plunder. This is the principle of justice, peace, order, stability, harmony, and logic. Until the day of my death, I shall proclaim this principle with all the force of my lungs, which, alas, is all too inadequate. We pause from the reading here to note that at the time this was written, Mr. Bastiat knew that he was dying of tuberculosis. Within a year, he had passed away. Bastiat continues. In all sincerity, can anything more than the absence of plunder be required of the law? Can the law, which necessarily requires the use of force, rationally be used for anything except protecting the rights of everyone? I defy anyone to extend it beyond this purpose without perverting it, and consequently turning might against right. This is the most fatal and most illogic social perversion that can possibly be imagined. It must be admitted that the true solution, so long searched for in the area of social relationships, is contained in these simple words. Law is organized justice. Now, this must be said. When justice is organized by law, that is, by force, this excludes the idea of using law or force to organize any human activity whatever, whether it be labor, charity, agriculture, commerce, industry, education, art, or religion. The organizing by law of any one of these would inevitably destroy the essential organization, justice. For truly, how can we imagine force being used against the liberty of citizens without it also being used against justice, and thus acting against its proper purpose? Here I encounter the most popular fallacy of our times. It is not considered sufficient that the law be just. It must be philanthropic. Nor is it sufficient that the law should guarantee to every citizen the free and inoffensive use of his faculties for physical, intellectual, and moral self-improvement. Instead, it is demanded that the law should directly extend welfare, education, and morality throughout the nation. This is the seductive lure of socialism, and I repeat again, these two uses of the law are in direct contradiction to each other. We must choose between them. A citizen cannot at the same time be free and not free. Mr. de Lamartine once wrote to me thusly, "Your doctrine," he said, "is only half of my program. You have stopped at liberty. I go on to fraternity." I answered him, "The second half of your program will destroy the first." In fact, it is impossible for me to separate the word fraternity from the word voluntary. I cannot possibly understand how fraternity can be legally enforced without liberty being legally destroyed, and thus justice being legally trampled underfoot. Legal plunder has two roots. One of them, as I have said before, is in human greed. The other is in false philanthropy. And at this point, I think I should explain exactly what I mean by the word plunder. I do not, as is often done, use the word in any vague, uncertain, approximate, or metaphorical sense. I use it in its scientific acceptance as expressing the idea opposite to that of property, wages, land, money, or whatever. When a portion of wealth is transferred from the person who owns it without his consent and without compensation, and whether by force or by fraud, to anyone who does not own it, then I say that property is violated, that an act of plunder is committed. I say that this act is exactly what the law is supposed to suppress always and everywhere. When the law itself commits this act that it is supposed to suppress, I say that plunder is still committed, and I add that from the point of view of society and welfare, this aggression against rights is even worse. In this case of legal plunder, however, the person who receives the benefits is not responsible for the act of plundering. The responsibility for this legal plunder rests with the law, the legislator, and society itself, and therein lies the political danger. It is to be regretted that the word plunder is offensive. I have tried in vain to find an inoffensive word, for I would not at any time, especially now, wish to add an irritating word to our dissensions. Thus, whether I am believed or not, I declare that I do not mean to attack the intentions or the morality of anyone. Rather, I am attacking an idea which I believe to be false, a system which appears to me to be unjust, an injustice so independent of personal intentions that each of us profits from it without wishing to do so, and suffers from it without knowing the cause of the suffering. The sincerity of those who advocate protectionism, socialism, and communism is not here questioned. Any writer who would do that must be influenced by a political spirit or a political fear. It is to be pointed out, however, that protectionism, socialism, and communism are basically the same plant in three different stages of its growth. All that can be said is that legal plunder is more visible in communism because it is complete plunder, and in protectionism because the plunder is limited to specific groups and industries. Thus it follows that of the three systems, socialism is the vaguest, the most indecisive, and consequently the most sincere stage of development. But sincere or insincere, the intentions of persons are not here under question. In fact, I have already said that legal plunder is based partially on philanthropy, even though it is a false philanthropy. With this explanation, let us examine the value, the origin, and the tendency of this popular aspiration which claims to accomplish the general welfare by general plunder. Since the law organizes justice, the socialists ask why the law should not also organize labor, education, and religion. Why should not law be used for these purposes? Because it could not organize labor, education, and religion without destroying justice. We must remember that law is force, and that consequently the proper functions of the law cannot lawfully extend beyond the proper functions of force. When law and force keep a person within the bounds of justice, they impose nothing but a mere negation. They oblige him only to abstain from harming others. They violate neither his personality, his liberty, nor his property. They safeguard all of these. They are defensive. They defend equally the rights of all. The harmlessness of the mission performed by law and lawful defense is self-evident. The usefulness is obvious, and the legitimacy cannot be disputed. As a friend of mine once remarked, this negative concept of law is so true that the statement, "The purpose of the law is to cause justice to reign," is not a rigorously accurate statement. It ought to be stated that the purpose of the law is to prevent injustice from reigning. In fact, it is injustice instead of justice that has an existence of its own. Justice is achieved only when injustice is absent. But when the law, by means of its necessary agent force, imposes upon men a regulation of labor, a method or a subject of education, a religious faith or creed, then the law is no longer negative. It acts positively upon people. It substitutes the will of the legislator for their own wills, the initiative of the legislator for their own initiatives. When this happens, the people no longer need to discuss, to compare, to plan ahead. The law does all this for them. Intelligence becomes a useless prop for the people. They cease to be men. They lose their personality, their liberty, their property. Try to imagine a regulation of labor imposed by force that is not a violation of liberty, a transfer of wealth imposed by force that is not a violation of property. If you cannot reconcile these contradictions, then you must conclude that the law cannot organize labor and industry without organizing injustice. When a politician views society from the seclusion of his office, he is struck by the spectacle of the inequality that he sees. He deplores the deprivations which are the lot of so many of our brothers, deprivations which appear to be even sadder when contrasted with luxury and wealth. Perhaps the politician should ask himself whether this state of affairs has not been caused by old conquests and lootings and by more recent legal plunder. Perhaps he should consider this proposition. Since all persons seek well-being and perfection, would not a condition of justice be sufficient to cause the greatest effort toward progress and the greatest possible equality that is compatible with individual responsibility? Would not this be in accord with the concepts of individual responsibility, which God has willed in order that mankind may have the choice between vice and virtue and the resulting punishment and reward? But the politician never gives this a thought. His mind turns to organizations, combinations, and arrangements, legal or apparently legal. He attempts to remedy the evil by increasing and perpetuating the very thing that caused the evil in the first place, legal plunder. We have seen that justice is a negative concept. Is there even one of these positive legal actions that does not contain the principle of plunder? You say, there are persons who have no money, and you turn to the law. But the law is not a breast that fills itself with milk, nor are the lacteal veins of the law supplied with milk from a source outside the society. Nothing can enter the public treasury for the benefit of one citizen or one class, unless other citizens and other classes have been forced to send it in. If every person draws from the treasury the amount that he has put in, it is true that the law then plunders nobody. But this process does nothing for the person who has no money. It does not promote equality of income. The law can be an instrument of equalization only as it takes from some persons and gives to other persons. When the law does this, it is an instrument of plunder. With this in mind, examine the protected tariffs, subsidies, guaranteed profits, guaranteed jobs, public education, progressive taxation, free credit, and public works. You will find that they are always based on legal plunder or organized injustice. You say there are persons who lack education, and you turn to the law. But the law is not in itself a torch of learning which shines its light abroad. The law extends over a society where some persons have knowledge and others do not, where some citizens need to learn and others can teach. In this matter of education, there are only two alternatives. It permits the teaching and learning to operate freely and without the use of force, or it can force human wills in this matter by taking from some of them enough to pay the teachers who are appointed by government to instruct others without charge. But in the second case, the law commits legal plunder by violating liberty and property. You say, here are persons who are lacking in morality or religion, and you turn to the law. But law is force, and need I point out what a violent and futile effort it is to use this monstrous legal plunder that results from such systems and such clearly distilled from even from themselves under the seductive names of fraternity, unity, organization, and association. Because we ask so little from the law, only justice, the socialists thereby assume that we reject fraternity, unity, organization, and association. But we assure the socialists that we repudiate only forced organization, not natural organization. We repudiate the forms of association that are forced upon us, not free association. We repudiate forced fraternity, not true fraternity. We repudiate the artificial unity that does nothing more than deprive persons of individual responsibility. We do not repudiate the natural unity of mankind under providence. Socialism, like the ancient ideas from which it springs, confuses the distinction between government and society. As a result of this, every time we object to a thing being done by government, the socialists conclude that we object to its being done at all. We disapprove of state education. Then the socialists say we are opposed to any education. We object to a state religion. Then the socialists say that we want no religion at all. We object to a state enforcement. Then they say that we are against equality, and so on and so on. It is as if the socialists were to accuse us of not wanting persons to eat because we do not want the state to raise grain. How did politicians ever come to believe this weird idea that the law could be made to produce what it does not contain, the wealth, science, and religion that in a positive sense constitute prosperity? Is it due to the influence of our modern writers on public affairs? Present-day writers, especially those of the socialist school of thought, base their various theories upon one common hypothesis. They divide mankind into two parts. People in general, with the exception of the writer himself, form the first group. The writer all alone forms the second and most important group. Surely this is the weirdest and most conceited notion that ever entered a human brain. In fact, these writers on public affairs begin by supposing that people have within themselves no means of discernment, no motivation to action. The writers assume that people are inert matter, passive particles, motionless atoms, at best a kind of vegetation indifferent to its own manner of existence. They assume that people are susceptible to being shaped by the will and the hand of another person into an infinite variety of forms, more or less symmetrical, artistic, and perfected. Moreover, not one of these writers on governmental affairs hesitates to imagine that he himself, under the title of organizer, discoverer, legislator, or founder, is this will and hand, this universal motivating force, this creative power whose sublime mission is to mold these scattered materials, persons, into a society. These socialist writers look upon people in the same manner that the gardener views his trees. Just as the gardener capriciously shapes the trees into pyramids, parasols, cubes, vases, fans, and other forms, just so does the socialist writer whimsically shape human beings into groups, series, centers, subcenters, honeycombs, labor corps, and other variations. And just as the gardener needs axes, pruning hooks, saws, and shears to shape his trees, just so does the socialist writer need the force that he can find only in law to shape human beings. For this purpose, he devises tariff laws, tax laws, relief laws, and school laws. Socialists look upon people as raw material to be formed into social combinations. This is so true that if by chance the socialists have any doubts about the success of these combinations, they will demand that a small portion of mankind be set aside to experiment upon. The popular idea of trying all systems is well known, and one socialist leader has been known seriously to demand that the Constituent Assembly give him a small district with all its inhabitants to try his experiments upon. In the same manner, an inventor makes a model before he constructs the full-size machine. The chemist wastes some chemicals, the farmer wastes some seeds and land to try out an idea. But what a difference there is between the gardener and his trees, between the inventor and his machine, between the chemist and his elements, between the farmer and his seeds. And in all sincerity, the socialist thinks that there is the same difference between him and mankind. It is no wonder that the writers of the 19th century look upon society as an artificial creation of the legislator's genius. This idea, the fruit of classical education, has taken possession of all the intellectuals and famous writers of our country. To these intellectuals and writers, the relationship between persons and the legislator appear to be the same as the relationship between the clay and the potter. Moreover, even when they have consented to recognize a principle of action in the heart of man and a principle of discernment in man's intellect, they have considered these gifts from God to be fatal gifts. They have thought that persons under the impulse of these two gifts would fatally tend to ruin themselves. They assume that if the legislators left persons free to follow their own inclinations, they would arrive at atheism instead of religion, ignorance instead of knowledge, poverty instead of production and exchange. According to these writers, it is indeed fortunate that heaven has bestowed upon certain men, governors and legislators, the exact opposite inclinations, not only for their own sake, but also for the sake of the rest of the world. While mankind tends toward evil, the legislators yearn for good. While mankind advances toward darkness, the legislators aspire for enlightenment. While mankind is drawn toward vice, the legislators are attracted toward virtue. Since they have decided that this is the true state of affairs, they then demand the use of force in order to substitute their own inclinations for those of the human race. Open at random any book on philosophy, politics, or history, and you will probably see how deeply rooted in our country is this idea, the child of classical studies, the mother of socialism. In all of them, you will probably find this idea that mankind is merely inert matter, receiving life, organization, morality, and prosperity from the power of the state. And even worse, it will be stated that mankind tends toward degeneration and is stopped from this downward course only by the mysterious hand of the legislator. Conventional classical thought everywhere says that behind passive society there is a concealed power called law or legislator, or called by some other terminology that designates some unnamed person or person of undisputed influence and authority which moves, controls, benefits, and improves mankind. Actually, it is not strange that during the 17th and 18th centuries, the human race was regarded as inert matter, ready to receive everything, form, face, energy, movement, life, from a great prince or a great legislator or a great genius. These centuries were nourished on the study of antiquity, and antiquity presents everywhere, in Egypt, Persia, Greece, Rome, the spectacle of a few men molding mankind according to their whims, thanks to the prestige of force and of fraud. But this does not prove that this situation is desirable. It proves only that since men and society are capable of improvement, it is naturally to be expected that error, ignorance, despotism, slavery, and superstition should be greatest towards the origin of history. Knowledge appears and grows with the passage of time, and in proportion to this growth of knowledge, might takes the side of right, and society regains possession of itself. Actually, what is the political struggle that we witness? It is the intensive struggle of all people toward liberty. And what is this liberty, whose very name makes the heart beat faster and shakes the world? Is it not the union of all liberties, liberty of conscience, of education, of association, of the press, of travel, of labor, of trade? In short, is not liberty the freedom of every person to make full use of his faculties, so long as he does not harm other persons while doing so? Is not liberty the destruction of all despotism, including, of course, legal despotism? Finally, is not liberty the restricting of the law only to its rational sphere of organizing the right of the individual to lawful self-defense, of punishing injustice? It must be admitted that the tendency of the human race toward liberty is largely thwarted. This is greatly due to a fatal desire, learned from the teachings of antiquity, that our writers on public affairs have in common. They desire to set themselves above mankind in order to arrange, organize, and regulate it according to their fancy. While society is struggling toward liberty, these famous men who put themselves at its head are filled with the spirit of the 17th and 18th centuries. They think only of subjecting mankind to the philanthropic tyranny of their own social inventions. Like Rousseau, they desire to force mankind docilely to bear this yoke of the public welfare that they have dreamed up in their own imaginations. This was especially true in 1789. No sooner was the old regime destroyed than society was subjected to still other artificial arrangements, always starting from the same point, the omnipotence of the law. Usually, however, the reformers, the legislators, and the writers on public affairs did not desire to impose direct despotism upon mankind. Oh no, they are too moderate and philanthropic for such direct action. Instead, they turn to the law for this despotism, this absolutism, this omnipotence. They desire only to make the laws. The strange phenomenon of our times, one which will probably astound our descendants, is the doctrine based on this triple hypothesis: the total inertness of mankind, the omnipotence of the law, and the infallibility of the legislator. These three ideas form the sacred symbol of those who proclaim themselves totally democratic. The advocates of this doctrine also profess to be social. So far as they are democratic, they place unlimited faith in mankind. But so far as they are social, they regard mankind as little better than mud. Let us examine this contrast in greater detail. What is the attitude of the Democrat when political rights are under discussion? How does he regard the people when a legislator is to be chosen? Then it is claimed that the people have an instinctive wisdom. They are gifted with the finest perception. Their will is always right. The general will cannot err. Voting cannot be too universal. When it is time to vote, apparently the voter is not to be asked for any guarantee of his wisdom. His will and capacity to choose wisely are taken for granted. Can the people be mistaken? Are we not living in an age of enlightenment? What, are the people always to be kept on leashes? Have they not won their rights by great effort and sacrifice? Have they not given ample proof of their intelligence and wisdom? Are they not adults? Are they not capable of judging for themselves? Do they not know what is best for themselves? Is there a class or a man who would be so bold as to set himself above the people and judge and act for them? No, the people are and should be free. They desire to manage their own affairs, and they shall do so. But when the legislator is finally elected, then indeed does the tone of his speech undergo a radical change. The people are returned to passiveness, inertness, and unconsciousness. The legislator enters into omnipotence. Now it is for him to initiate, to direct, to propel, and to organize. Mankind has only to submit. The hour of despotism has struck. We now observe this fatal idea. The people, who during the election were so wise, so moral, and so perfect, now have no tendencies whatsoever, or if they have any, they are tendencies that lead downward into degradation. But ought not the people to be given a little liberty? The Mr. Considerant has assured us that liberty leads inevitably to monopoly. We understand that liberty means competition, but according to Mr. Louis Blanc, competition is a system that ruins the businessman and exterminates the people. It is for this reason that free people are ruined and exterminated in proportion to their degree of freedom. Possibly Mr. Louis Blanc in this year of 1850 should observe the results of competition in, for example, Switzerland, Holland, England, and the United States. Mr. Louis Blanc also tells us that competition leads to monopoly. And by the same reasoning, he thus informs us that low prices lead to high prices, that competition drives production to destructive activity, that competition drains away the sources of purchasing power, that competition forces an increase in production while at the same time it forces a decrease in consumption. Well, from this it follows that free people produce for the sake of not consuming, that liberty means oppression and madness among the people, and that Mr. Lewis Blank absolutely must attend to it. Well, what liberty should the legislators permit people to have? Liberty of conscience? But if this were permitted, we would see the people taking this opportunity to become atheists. Then liberty of education? But parents would pay professors to teach their children immorality and falsehoods. Besides, if education were left to national liberty, it would cease to be national, and we would be teaching our children the ideas of the Turks or Hindus. Whereas, thanks to this legal despotism over education, our children now have the good fortune to be taught the noble ideas of the Romans. Then liberty of labor? But that would mean competition, which in turn leaves production unconsumed, ruins businessmen, and exterminates the people. Perhaps liberty of trade? But everyone knows, and the advocates of protective tariffs have proved over and over again, that freedom of trade ruins every person who engages in it, and that it is necessary to suppress freedom of trade in order to prosper. Possibly then, liberty of association. But according to socialist doctrine, true liberty and voluntary association are in contradiction to each other, and the purpose of the socialists is to suppress liberty of association precisely in order to force people to associate together in true liberty. Clearly then, the conscience of the social democrats cannot permit persons to have any liberty, because they believe that the nature of mankind tends always toward every kind of degradation and disaster. Thus, of course, the legislatures must make plans for the people in order to save them from themselves. This line of reasoning brings us to the challenging question: if people are as incapable, as immoral, and as ignorant as the politicians indicate, then why is the right of these same people to vote defended with such passionate insistence? The claims of these organizers of humanity raise another question which I have often asked them, and which, so far as I know, they have never answered. If the natural tendencies of mankind are so bad that it is not safe to permit people to be free, how is it that the tendencies of these organizers are always good? Do not the legislators and their appointed agents also belong to the human race? Or do they believe that they themselves are made of a finer clay than the rest of mankind? The organizers maintain that society, when left undirected, rushes headlong to its inevitable destruction because the instincts of the people are so perverse. The legislators claim to stop this suicidal course and to give it a saner direction. Apparently, then, the legislators and the organizers have received from heaven an intelligence and virtue that place them beyond and above mankind. If so, let them show their titles to this superiority. They would be the shepherds over us, their sheep? Certainly, such an arrangement presupposes that they are naturally superior to the rest of us, and certainly we are fully justified in demanding from the legislators and organizers proof of this natural superiority. Now, please understand that I do not dispute their right to invent social combinations, to advertise them, to advocate them, and to try them upon themselves at their own expense and risk. But I do dispute their right to impose these plans upon us by law, by force, and to compel us to pay for them with our taxes. I do not insist that the supporters of these various social schools of thought renounce their various ideas. I insist only that they renounce this one idea that they have in common. They need only to give up the idea of forcing us to acquiesce to their groups and theories, their socialized projects, their free credit banks, their Greco-Roman concept of morality, and their commercial regulations. I ask only that we be permitted to decide upon these plans for ourselves, that we not be forced to accept them directly or indirectly if we find them to be contrary to our best interests or repugnant to our consciences. But these organizers desire access to the tax funds and to the power of the law in order to carry out their plans. In addition to being oppressive and unjust, this desire also implies the fatal supposition that the organizer is infallible and mankind is incompetent. But again, if persons are incompetent to judge for themselves, then why all this talk about universal suffrage? This contradiction in ideas is unfortunately but logically reflected in events in France. For example, Frenchmen have led all other nations in obtaining their rights, or more accurately, their political demands. Yet, this fact has in no respect prevented us from becoming the most governed, the most regulated, the most imposed upon, the most harnessed, and the most exploited people in Europe. France also leads all other nations as the one where revolutions are constantly to be anticipated. And under the circumstances, it is quite natural that this should be the case. This will remain the case so long as human beings with feelings continue to remain passive, so long as they consider themselves incapable of bettering their prosperity and happiness by their own intelligence and their own energy, so long as they expect everything from the law. In short, so long as they imagine that their relationship to the state is the same as that of the sheep to the shepherd. As long as these ideas prevail, it is clear that the responsibility of government is enormous. Good fortune and bad fortune, wealth and destruction, equality and inequality, virtue and vice, all then depend upon political administration. It is burdened with everything. It undertakes everything. It does everything. Therefore, it is responsible for everything. If we are fortunate, then government has a claim to our gratitude. But if we are unfortunate, then government must bear the blame. For are not our persons and property now at the disposal of government? Is not the law omnipotent? In creating a monopoly of education, the government must answer to the hopes of the fathers of families who have thus been deprived of their liberty. And if these hopes are shattered, whose fault is it? In regulating industry, the government has contracted to make it prosper. Otherwise, it is absurd to deprive industry of its liberty. And if industry now suffers, whose fault is it? In meddling with the balance of trade by playing with tariffs, the government thereby contracts to make trade prosper. And if this results in destruction instead of prosperity, whose fault is it? In giving the maritime industries protection in exchange for their liberty, the government undertakes to make them profitable. And if they become a burden to the taxpayers, whose fault is it? Thus, there is not a grievance in the nation for which the government does not voluntarily make itself responsible. Is it surprising, then, that every failure increases the threat of another revolution in France? And what remedy is proposed for this? To extend indefinitely the domain of the law, that is, the responsibility of government. But if the government undertakes to control and to raise wages and cannot do it, if the government undertakes to care for all who may be in want and cannot do it, if the government undertakes to support all unemployed workers and cannot do it, if the government undertakes to lend interest-free money to all borrowers and cannot do it, if in these words we regret to say, escaped from the pen of Mr. de Lamartine, quote, the state considers that its purpose is to enlighten, to develop, to enlarge, to strengthen, to spiritualize, and to sanctify the soul of the people, end quote. And if the government cannot do all of these things, what then? Is it not certain that after every government failure, which alas is more than probable, there will be an equally inevitable revolution? It is not true that the legislator has absolute power over our persons and property. The existence of persons and property preceded the existence of the legislator, and his function is only to guarantee their safety. It is not true that the function of law is to regulate our consciences, our ideas, our wills, our education, our opinions, our work, our trade, our talents, or our pleasures. The function of law is to protect the free exercise of these rights, and to prevent any person from interfering with the free exercise of these same rights by any other person. Since law necessarily requires the support of force, its lawful domain is only in the areas where the use of force is necessary. This is justice. Every individual has the right to use force for lawful self-defense. It is for this reason that the collective force, which is only the organized combination of the individual forces, may lawfully be used for the same purpose, and it cannot be used legitimately for any other purpose. Law is solely the organization of the individual right of self-defense, which existed before law was formalized. Law is justice. The mission of the law is not to oppress persons and plunder them of their property, even though the law may be acting in a philanthropic spirit. Its mission is to protect persons and property. Furthermore, it must not be said that the law may be philanthropic if in the process it refrains from oppressing persons and plundering them of their property. This would be a contradiction. The law cannot avoid having an effect upon persons and property. And if the law acts in any manner except to protect them, its actions then necessarily violate the liberty of persons and their right to own property. The law is justice, simple and clear, precise and bounded. Every eye can see it, and every mind can grasp it. For justice is measurable, immutable, and unchangeable. Justice is neither more than this, nor less than this. If you exceed this proper limit, if you attempt to make the law religious, fraternal, equalizing, philanthropic, industrial, literary, or artistic, you will then be lost in an uncharted territory, in vagueness and uncertainty, in a forced utopia, or even worse, a multitude of utopias, each striving to seize the law and impose it upon you. This is true because fraternity and philanthropy, unlike justice, do not have precise limits. Once started, where will you stop, and where will the law stop itself? Mr. de St. Cricq would extend his philanthropy only to some of the industrial groups. He would demand that the law control the consumer to benefit the producers. Mr. Considerant would sponsor the cause of the labor groups. He would use the law to secure for them a guaranteed minimum of clothing, housing, food, and all other necessities of life. Mr. Lewis Blank would say, and with reason, that these minimum guarantees are merely the beginning of complete fraternity. He would say that the law should give tools of production and free education to all working people. Another person would observe that this arrangement would still leave room for inequality. He would claim that the law should give to everyone, even in the most inaccessible hamlet, luxury, literature, and art. All of these proposals are the high road to communism. Legislation will then be, in fact it already is, the battlefield for the fantasies and greed of everyone. Law is justice. In this proposition, a simple and enduring government can be conceived. And I defy anyone to say how even the thought of revolution, of insurrection, of the slightest uprising could arise against the government whose organized force was confined only to suppressing injustice. Under such a regime, there would be the most prosperity, and it would be the most equally distributed. As for the sufferings that are inseparable from humanity, no one would even think of accusing the government for them. This is true because if the force of government were limited to suppressing injustice, then government would be as innocent of these sufferings as it is now innocent of changes in the temperature. As proof of this statement, consider this question. Have the people ever been shown to rise against the Court of Appeals or mob a justice of the peace in order to get higher wages, free credit, tools of production, favorable tariffs, or government-created jobs? Everyone knows perfectly well that such matters are not within the jurisdiction of the Court of Appeals or a justice of the peace. And if government were limited to its proper function, everyone would soon learn that these matters are not within the jurisdiction of the law itself. But make the laws upon the principle of fraternity, proclaim that all good and all bad stem from the law, that the law is responsible for all individual misfortunes and all social inequalities, then the door is open to an endless succession of complaints, irritations, troubles, and revolutions. Law is justice. And let it not be said, as it continually is said, that under this concept the law would be atheistic, individualistic, and heartless, that it would make mankind in its own image. This is an absurd conclusion, worthy only of those worshippers of government who believe that the law is mankind. Nonsense. Do these worshippers of government believe that free persons will cease to act? Does it follow that if we receive no energy from the law, we shall receive no energy at all? Does it follow that if the law is restricted to the function of protecting the free use of our faculties, we will be unable to use our faculties? Suppose that the law does not force us to follow certain forms of religion or systems of association or methods of education or regulations of labor or regulations of trade or plans for charity. Does it then follow that we shall eagerly plunge into atheism, hermitary, ignorance, misery, and greed? If we are free, does it follow that we shall no longer recognize the power and goodness of God? Does it follow that we shall then cease to associate with each other, to help each other, to love and to succor our unfortunate brothers, to study the secrets of nature, and to strive to improve ourselves to the best of our abilities? Law is justice. And it is under the law of justice, under the reign of right, under the influence of liberty, safety, stability, and responsibility, that every person will attain his real worth and the true dignity of his being. It is only under this law of justice that mankind will achieve, slowly no doubt, but certainly, God's design for the orderly and peaceful progress of humanity. It seems to me that this is theoretically right, for whatever the question under discussion, whether religious, philosophical, political, or economic, whether it concerns prosperity, morality, equality, right, justice, progress, responsibility, cooperation, property, labor, trade, capital, wages, taxes, population, finance, or government, at whatever point on the scientific horizon I begin my researches, I inevitably reach this one conclusion. The solution to the problems of human relationships is to be found in liberty. And does not experience prove this? Look at the entire world. Which countries contain the most peaceful, the most moral, and the happiest people? Those people are found in the countries where the law least interferes with private affairs, where government is least felt, where the individual has the greatest scope and free opinion the greatest influence, where administrative powers are fewest and simplest, where taxes are lightest and most nearly equal, and popular discontent the least excited and least justifiable, where individuals and groups most actively assume their responsibilities, and consequently where the morals of admittedly imperfect human beings are constantly improving, where trade assemblies and associations are the least restricted, where labor, capital, and population suffer the fewest forced displacements, where mankind most nearly follows its own natural inclinations, where the inventions of men are more nearly in harmony with the laws of God. In short, the happiest, most moral, and most peaceful people are those who most nearly follow this principle. Although mankind is not perfect, still all hope rests upon the free and voluntary actions of persons within the limits of right. Law or force is to be used for nothing except the administration of universal justice. This must be said. There are too many great men in the world. Legislators, organizers, do-gooders, leaders of the people, fathers of nations, and so on and so on. Too many persons place themselves above mankind. They make a career of organizing it, patronizing it, and ruling it. Now, someone will say, you yourself are doing this very thing. True, but it must be admitted that I act in an entirely different sense. if I have joined the ranks of the reformers, it is solely for the purpose of persuading them to leave people alone. I do not look upon people as Van Causen looked upon the automaton. Rather, just as the physiologist accepts the human body as it is, so do I accept people as they are. I desire only to study and to admire. My attitude toward all other persons is well illustrated by this story from a celebrated traveler. He arrived one day in the midst of a tribe of savages where a child had just been born. A crowd of soothsayers, magicians, and quacks, armed with rings, hooks, and cords, surrounded it. One said, "This child will never smell the perfume of a peace pipe unless I stretch his nostrils." Another said, "He will never be able to hear unless I draw his earlobes down to his shoulders." A third said, "He will never see the sunshine unless I slant his eyes." And another said, "He will never stand upright unless I bend his legs." A fifth said, "He will never learn to think unless I flatten his skull." "Stop," cried the traveler. "What God does is well done. Do not claim to know more than he. God has given organs to this frail creature. Let them develop and grow strong by exercise, use, experience, and liberty." God has given to men all that is necessary for them to accomplish their destinies. He has provided a social form as well as a human form. And these social organs of persons are so constituted that they will develop themselves harmoniously in the clean air of liberty. Away then with quacks and organizers. Away with their rings, chains, hooks, and pincers. Away with their artificial systems. Away with the whims of government administrators, their socialized projects, their centralization, their tariffs, their government schools, their state religions, their free credit, their bank monopolies, their regulations, their restrictions, their equalization by taxation, and their pious moralizations. And now that the legislators and do-gooders have so futilely inflicted so many systems upon society, may they finally end where they should have begun. May they reject all systems and try liberty. For liberty is an acknowledgement of faith in God and his works. This has been a presentation of the Spoken Word Library, a series of audio recordings dealing with topics of vital importance to you and your family. Each program is selected on the basis of its timeliness and its lasting reference value. The complete collection will enhance your personal library, and it will provide valuable information that generally is not available from other sources. For a free catalog of our programs, just send us your name and address. The Spoken Word Library is produced by American Media, so address your inquiry to American Media, Box 4646, Westlake Village, California 91359.